Healthcare has always been one of the most paradoxical industries in human history. It is built on cutting-edge science, yet delivered through systems that often feel decades behind. It deals with life and death outcomes, yet surrounds patients with paperwork, waiting rooms, and fragmentation. For a long time, this contradiction was accepted as inevitable. But the rise of MedTech startups signals a quiet rebellion against that assumption, not through reckless disruption, but through deeply intentional innovation. Unlike consumer tech, healthcare does not reward speed alone. It rewards trust. And this is why the most influential MedTech startups did not begin with technology as their first question. They began with suffering, a delayed diagnosis, a missed signal, a preventable complication. Books and case studies on healthcare innovation reveal that the strongest MedTech founders are often those who encountered the system at its weakest point when it failed them or someone they loved. Innovation, in this space, is rarely abstract. It is personal. What separates healthcare disruption from disruption in other industries is the cost of error. In e-commerce, a bug loses money. In healthcare, it can cost a life. This reality reshapes the entire startup mindset. MedTech founders learn early that moving fast is meaningless if you move wrong. As a result, disruption in healthcare is not explosive, it is surgical. One bottleneck removed, one signal clarified, one workflow simplified. Progress happens incrementally, but its impact compounds. One of the most profound shifts driven by MedTech startups is the transition from reactive care to proactive care. Traditional healthcare waits for symptoms. Innovative startups monitor trends. Continuous glucose monitors, wearable ECG devices, AI-assisted imaging, and predictive analytics platforms extend care beyond clinic walls. They do not replace physicians, they amplify their reach. Books examining these technologies emphasize that earlier insight, not better treatment, is often what saves lives. Another central theme in MedTech innovation is decentralization. Historically, healthcare has been institution-centric. Hospitals, labs, and clinics dictated access. MedTech startups are gradually inverting this model by bringing care closer to the patient. Telemedicine platforms collapse geography. At-home diagnostics collapse logistics. Portable devices collapse dependency on large infrastructure. This shift does not lower medical standards. It lowers friction. And friction, in healthcare, is often the silent killer. Yet every MedTech startup faces the same immovable force: regulation. Books on healthcare entrepreneurship are unequivocal on this point. Regulation is not the enemy of innovation, it is the terrain. The startups that survive are not those that fight regulation, but those that understand it deeply. FDA pathways, clinical trials, data privacy laws, reimbursement codes, these are not obstacles to be hacked around, but systems to be designed within. Compliance becomes not a burden, but a competitive moat. Clinician adoption emerges as another defining challenge. Doctors and nurses are not resistant to innovation. They are resistant to disruption that adds cognitive load. MedTech books repeatedly highlight failed products that looked brilliant on paper, but collapsed in practice because they ignored clinical workflow. Successful startups design with clinicians, not for them. They reduce alerts instead of adding them. They clarify decisions instead of complicating them. When a product saves time, trust follows naturally. Data sits at the center of modern MedTech, but the books are careful to dismantle a common illusion. More data does not equal better care. Interpretation matters. Integration matters. A startup that generates insights but cannot embed them into existing electronic health records creates noise, not value. The most effective MedTech companies obsess over interoperability because healthcare is not a greenfield, it is an ecosystem layered with history. Another critical pattern appears around incentives. Healthcare systems do not always reward outcomes, they reward procedures. Innovative startups that ignore reimbursement realities struggle no matter how clinically sound their technology is. The books show that successful MedTech founders align innovation with financial pathways that already exist, or patiently help create new ones. Disruption without economic viability is not innovation, it is experimentation without survival. Ethics also plays a heavier role in MedTech than in almost any other startup category. Data privacy is not optional. Bias in algorithms is not theoretical. Transparency is not a branding choice. The books are clear that healthcare startups carry moral responsibility alongside commercial ambition. Trust, once lost in this domain, is nearly impossible to regain. This is why the strongest MedTech companies treat ethics as product design, not legal defense. As these themes converge, a deeper insight emerges. MedTech startups do not disrupt healthcare by replacing the system. They disrupt it by supporting it where it breaks. They insert precision where there was approximation, continuity where there was fragmentation, visibility where there was delay. This kind of disruption is quieter than headlines suggest, but far more durable. And this is where the story begins to sharpen. Because once a MedTech startup understands that healthcare is not a market to conquer, but a responsibility to shoulder, the question shifts. It is no longer how do we scale, but how do we scale without losing trust? It is at this point where innovation meets restraint that the true character of healthcare disruption is revealed, unfolding slowly and carefully. Like unfolding slowly and carefully, like a surgeon's hand moving with precision rather than haste. And this is where the true disruption in healthcare reveals itself, not in bold headlines or inflated valuations, but in the quiet discipline of startups that choose trust over speed and responsibility over spectacle. In the second half of the MedTech story, the books and real-world cases converge on a single truth. Scale is not the enemy of healthcare innovation, but careless scale is. As MedTech startups grow, every design decision echoes louder. A small UX flaw becomes a systemic risk. A minor data bias becomes a clinical liability. The startups that endure are those that scale their values at the same rate they scale their technology. One of the most important shifts that happens at this stage is a redefinition of success. Early on, success looks like adoption. Later, it looks like outcomes. The most respected MedTech companies measure themselves not just by user growth, but by reductions in error rates, earlier interventions, improved adherence, and better long-term health indicators. Books analyzing these companies emphasize that when success metrics align with patient well-being, innovation stays grounded, even under pressure. Another defining characteristic of enduring MedTech startups is how they handle uncertainty. Medicine is probabilistic by nature. No algorithm is perfect. No diagnostic tool is infallible. Ethical MedTech companies design for uncertainty rather than denying it. They communicate confidence intervals. They support clinician override. They make limitations visible instead of hiding them behind polished interfaces. This humility, paradoxically, increases trust. Clinicians and patients are more willing to rely on tools that acknowledge what they cannot do. As these startups mature, partnerships become more important than disruption itself. Hospitals, insurers, regulators, and legacy providers are no longer obstacles. They are collaborators. The books show that healthcare innovation accelerates when startups integrate into existing systems rather than trying to replace them wholesale. Interoperability agreements, shared protocols, and co-designed pilots allow innovation to move faster precisely because it moves together. Another critical insight emerges around equity. MedTech has the power to widen access or deepen disparity. Books examining the future of healthcare innovation stress that startups must consciously design for inclusivity. Algorithms trained on narrow populations can misdiagnose others. Devices priced for affluent markets can exclude those who need them most. The most forward-thinking MedTech founders treat equity not as a social add-on, but as a design constraint. They know that healthcare innovation that only works for some is incomplete by definition. Over time, the role of the founder also changes. Early-stage MedTech founders are builders. Later, they become stewards. Their job shifts from pushing innovation forward to protecting its integrity. Culture becomes critical. Teams must feel empowered to raise concerns, slow down launches, and question assumptions. Books repeatedly show that the most damaging failures in healthcare innovation occurred not because someone lacked intelligence, but because no one felt safe enough to say, "We're not ready." And then there is the long view. Healthcare disruption does not resolve in quarters, it unfolds over decades. The most successful MedTech startups are patient by necessity. They understand that trust accrues slowly and compounds quietly. They resist the urge to overpromise. They allow evidence to speak louder than marketing. In doing so, they build credibility that outlasts any single product cycle. This is the quiet climax of the story. Disrupting healthcare is not about tearing down an old system. It is about reinforcing it where it is fragile and modernizing it where it is outdated. The startups that succeed are those that recognize the weight of what they are touching. Human lives, human fear, human hope. They move carefully, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand the cost of error. And so, the lesson from MedTech innovation becomes clear. True disruption in healthcare does not announce itself loudly. It integrates seamlessly. It earns trust one decision at a time. It respects the complexity of medicine while refusing to accept its inefficiencies as permanent. It proves that technology, when guided by empathy and restraint, can make healthcare not just more advanced, but more humane. If this story resonated with you, reflect on one question. If your product or idea touched someone's health tomorrow, what responsibility would that impose on how you build today? Share that thought. And if you want to continue exploring how innovation, ethics, and long-term thinking intersect in the most consequential industries, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and return. Because the most meaningful disruption is the kind that leaves the system stronger than it found it.